So I'm going to rank all 50 of the DC animated movies. It's a particular line of DC animated movies, so it doesn't include things like Batman, Mask of the Phantasm, or Mystery of the Batwoman, because they're linked to Batman animated series, things like that. These have a particular label on them. You can look them up, Wikipedia them to find out the complete list of movies. But so far, there have been 50 released in the collection. There is a 51st on the way in the shape of Warworld. There's been 50, so I thought perfect time to rank them all. That's a lot of movies to talk about, so I'm going to try and not waffle on too much about them. A lot of these, it's been a while, to be perfectly honest, since I've seen a lot of them, so I am going just off memory. So I won't say this is a definitive ranking for me, but I can say that my top 10 certainly is probably pretty much set in stone. There's a lot on here that, if rewatched, could go differently. But for now, this is how I'd rank. Catwoman Hunted, for me, it just made me want to vomit in my mouth. I felt it just felt like they were pushing the whole lesbian thing, and it was just a very woke kind of production that, yeah, I didn't enjoy it, to be perfectly honest. The music in it was pretty terrible, and the characterizations were not particularly engaging for me. Batman, The Doom That Came to Gotham, again, just not an interesting film. It deals with the whole Lovecraftian Cthulhu mythology, which has never interested me. Big tentacled monster that comes from space it's not that appealing a threat for me. It's lacking in personality. I prefer a villain that is, has more personality, basically. This is just a big tentacle monster, and the story itself, again, the characterizations were just not that well done. Green Lantern, Emerald Knights suffers primarily because it's actually a bunch of short films stuck together with a through line, so it doesn't really feel like its own thing. It just feels like all these different films kind of fighting with each other, and it covers a bunch of characters I just quite frankly don't care about. Give me Hal Jordan, give me John Stewart, centre story around them, but all these other people, I get what he's trying to do, but I'm just like, yeah, I'm not engaged enough. You got to introduce these characters, tell a story for them, and make us warm to them and care for them, all within the space of like 20 minutes here, 10 minutes there, and you're fighting an uphill battle. Superman versus the Elite. I'm torn with this one. It's not a bad story. There is a good story there, but I don't care for the villains. I find the villains to be quite weak, and I particularly don't like the voice of like a character like Manchester Black. Apparently the actor that played that guy is British, but he sounds like fake British. He sounds like the kind of accent that people in America give to a British character because that's how they feel all British people speak, and it isn't. And it's just like, yeah, it sounds put on. So all the way through it, it just annoys me. Justice League Throne of Atlantis is kind of like an origin story for Aquaman. It centers around his world, but I feel like they rush through quite a lot of stuff. I think the first 2/3 of the film are actually okay. They're pretty decent as far as an animated origin story goes. But when we get into the final act, there's a lot of real big holes in logic with regards to powers and what the Atlanteans can do and therefore should do if they're really going to go on a full-scale attack, but instead don't. And it makes the whole thing kind of fall apart for me in terms of logic. Justice Society World War II really does have the potential to go further up on this list. I've only seen it once. I think I was quite tired when I watched it, and to be perfectly honest, I found it boring. I just found it a bit dull. There's not a right lot I remember about it that sticks out, and that's really the only reason it isn't lower, because there's nothing painfully bad about it I can remember. I just don't remember anything. It needs another watch, basically, and hopefully it's just that I was tired when I watched it, and that's why. But for now, I'm sticking it here. Legion of Superheroes was quite a fun movie. I thought that the collection of characters was interesting. I like Supergirl, but I do feel that having this as her introduction to within the new set of DC universe movies that they've got going. It was a bit disappointing. I feel like we needed a better. We needed to bring her into this world in a bit of a better way. Except that they've come to the point where they're saying, look, you know these characters, so let's just get on with it. But it makes it feel a bit rushed. And yeah, I enjoyed it. I think, again, it loses a little bit of steam towards the end, as some of these often do. But I like the setup. I like Kara as a main character. I think they do a pretty good job of making you warm to her as a central character in her own movie. All-Star Superman, for me, is one of those films that it's an adaptation of like a series of comic books that ran over the course of like a year. And because of that, it does feel, you feel those chapters, you know, it feels very kind of serialized. It feels like a serial that's been stuck together, and because of that, it just never truly coalesces as its own kind of full movie. I just feel like, yes, that chapter covers that comic book, that chapter covers that comic book. So yeah, and I'm not overly keen on the representations of a lot of the characters. It does go for that 1950s sensibility, but maybe a little bit too much. It does lean into some of those sci-fi aspects too much. It's fine. It's not offensive. It's just, doesn't blow me away. Batman Soul of the Dragon takes the world of Batman and places it within the setting of like a 1970s kung fu movie. You know, think Enter the Dragon, that kind of thing. It's a Batman movie in that style. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. I like the fact that they brought King Snake finally onto the screen, although I don't think the representation of him is particularly well done. I'm just glad they used him. But again, this is one of those films that the tone for me, I'm not that big on. I'm not that big into those kind of 70s kung fu type movies with that a particular kind of music and style and whatnot. That's what they were going for. So if you like that, you'll probably love this. I don't, so I didn't. It's fine. It's, you know, I'll probably watch it again at some point, but it's not going to be my go-to Batman movie. Justice League Dark, again, it's an okay movie. It kind of rattles along, but I'm not that big on magic. You know, like films concerning magic and whatnot. I just find like you can have characters just do anything and not have to really explain it. You know, if somebody's got to punch someone in order to bring them down, or they've got to outsmart them in some way by solving a puzzle or whatever, I get that. I understand the logistics of that. Whereas when you've got like magic powers that you're kind of like, okay, so what's the rules here? I'm not entirely sure. 1 minute it feels like these are the rules, the next minute it feels like this is the rules. And you can just do whatever you want and not have to explain it. And that's the problem with a movie like Justice League Dark for me, because it hinges entirely on that kind of setup. Green Lantern Beware My Power gives Jon Stewart his day in the sun, so to speak. Jon Stewart's never been a favourite character of mine. I find him to be a bit too boring, a bit too... I mean, he's an ex-military man, so he's all about discipline and this, that and the other. But when you put that on screen, it doesn't make for the most interesting of characters. It makes him a bit dull. That's how I found him in the animated series, to be perfectly honest. That's kind of how I find him here. But the movie itself is fairly entertaining. There's some nice bursts of action in it, and I do like a lot of the supporting characters and the villains. And you know, it's nothing breathtaking. It doesn't reinvent the wheel. It's a pretty generic superhero movie, but it's pretty decent. Justice League War is another one of them movies that I don't remember all too much about. I do think I remember something about Superman kind of being in a bunker somewhere and not given daylight. Again, like I say, it's hazy, but going off the score I gave it on Letterboxd and vague memories that it was fairly action-packed and brought all the Justice League together in a reasonably satisfying way. I'll stick it here. That's about all I can say. Batman the Killing Joke is literally a film of two halves. You've got The Killing Joke, which is the actual adaptation of the Killing Joke story, which is pretty phenomenal because that story is phenomenal and they've got the greatest Batman voice cast ever in the shape of Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill. So, you know, awesome. But this should have been a 40-minute movie. What they've done is they've realised, well, in order to make this a feature film, we need to tack on half an hour at the beginning and flesh it out a bit. And they come up with this BS story about Batgirl, and it's not good. So yeah, the actual Killing Joke stuff, if I ever put this film on, I go straight to that and I just watch it as a 40-minute film. The stuff at the beginning, not so much. Superman Unbound it's a pretty generic Superman film, but it's quite action-packed. I like their interpretation of Brainiac in it. It's a solid, you know, mano-a-mano matchup of Superman versus Brainiac. I find it entertaining. It's one of those that doesn't get that highly rated amongst fans from what I can see, but I actually thought it was much better than the reputation that precedes it. Superman Batman Public Enemies is actually a pretty decent adaptation of the source material from the comic books, although it does have the problem of being a pretty good adaptation of the source material from the comic books. It's quite faithful, and yeah, it's one of those where the setup's pretty good, the idea behind the story is pretty good, a lot of the characters that come into it are pretty good, the animation is on point. But the final act of the film kind of loses brownie points for going a little bit too out there. A lot of it, the rest of it's a bit more grounded than the final act, and because of that, it's like it makes the tone go slightly off. So it loses some points there. But it's a good teaming. It's a solid teaming of Batman and Superman. Wonder Woman Bloodlines deals with the creation of the Silver Swan villain. I think they do okay with that. I think Rosario Dawson is a great choice for the voice of Wonder Woman. Again, the film does suffer from some of that wokeness creeping in, where they throw all these, you know, things about Etta Candy being a lesbian, and that's fine. I've got no problem with having lesbian characters in things, but when you make that their sole defining feature, where, you know, they're coming out with comments just to point out the fact, hey, I'm a lesbian. It's like, okay, cool. Batman Assault on Arkham. It's in fact it's more of a Suicide Squad movie, and it does tie into the Batman Arkham games as well. It's more set in that world. So yeah, it's quite entertaining. I've never played the games, but I like this movie. I like the Suicide Squad. I like the idea of teaming up a bunch of misfit villains who shouldn't really be able to work together, and kind of force them to go on a mission together. It's a cool setup, and it works. You know, Dirty Dozen kind of vibe to it. The animation's pretty solid. The story's pretty solid. Batman's pretty badass in the film as well. Son of Batman brings Damian Wayne to the screen. That is, of course, the son of Batman, son of Bruce Wayne. He becomes Robin, and I didn't like him in the comic books at the time this movie came out, so I wasn't overly keen on this movie when it first came out. Various stories around the character have kind of warmed me to him a little bit more over the years. So this movie has increased in my esteem over the years too. It's an entertaining action romp with a nice family dynamic going on at the heart of it, about Bruce having to be able to tame this child, really, having to get to grips with the fact that he's always been a bit of a dark horse, bit of a solo man. Even though he's had partners, he's always still been quite an isolated figure. But now he's got to contend with the fact that he has an actual son. Can he learn to emote? So yeah, that makes for an interesting dynamic. Justice League: The Fatal Five is essentially a Batman the Animated Series movie. The animation is done in the style of the Justice League. So you think Justice League and Justice League Unlimited, it's kind of done in that style. Now I know I said there wouldn't be any of those movies in this, but this is it is part of that range, part of that line. So as I say, you know, if you look up at the list on Wikipedia, that's the one I've gone off, and this does fit into it. So yeah, while there's no Mask of the Phantasm or anything like that, Fatal Five is amongst it, and it's a pretty solid movie. You know, I like the animation. It's really refreshing to go back to that style of animation after so many years of being away from it. and it's quite nostalgic in many ways for me, and that does perhaps earn it more brownie points than maybe it deserves. I don't know. Superman Man of Tomorrow is the first movie in the latest line of the DC Universe animated movies. So obviously after Justice League Apocalypse War, which ended that particular timeline, they kind of rebooted it, and this is the film that brought us back. Now, it gives us the character of Lobo, a character I've always been on the fence with. I liked what they did with the character in the TV show Krypton. I've never really been that big on him anywhere else. Here he's serviceable, whatever. But yeah, I like what they do with Superman. I think they take their time with the character. They do some pretty good character work with him, and I like the new animation style with those thicker lines. It kind of, brings us into a new era in a fairly solid way. Superman, Batman, Apocalypse does suffer from a few kind of holes in the plotting. There's a few areas where you're like, oh, they could have just written a few bits in here just to explain that a bit better. But for the most part, this has got some of the best action set pieces out of any of these DC animated movies, particularly a fight sequence right at the end between Supergirl and Darkseid and Superman. And Lauren Montgomery is one of the directors on this. The action sequences in films that have her name on do tend to be better. Teen Titans, Judas Contract it's not quite as good as Justice League versus the Teen Titans, but it is solid. It's got a really good villain in the shape of Deathstroke. I like that, it keeps you guessing as to what his plan's all about, what he's up to, and seeing a new character being introduced into the fold, and how the rest of the team interact with them. It makes for an entertaining movie. Superman Red Son is one of those Elseworld type stories that kind of asks the question, what would Superman look like if he hadn't landed in Kansas in America, but instead landed somewhere in Russia? This is the answer we get, which is actually not too dissimilar from what we get with him landing in America, which is that ultimately he can work for good. It's a solid movie about destiny and fate and the choices we make and nature versus nurture and all that kind of stuff. They throw Batman in there, so that obviously is a draw for me. But it's a good movie. I recommend it. It's pretty high on the list, I guess. It's halfway up. Injustice is obviously based on the computer games and the graphic novels that came out of that. I don't know which came first, to be honest, but either way, it is an adaptation of all that stuff, and it wasn't received particularly well. Now, I've never played the games, and I've never read the graphic novels on which it was based either. I enjoyed this movie. I enjoyed it a lot. I thought it was really good. I liked the characterizations. I liked the voices. I thought the animation was good. It had some good action set pieces. I liked what it did with like Harley Quinn and characters like that. I enjoyed it far more than I was led to believe I was going to. So yeah, I definitely think it's one of the most underrated on this list. Green Lantern First Flight is an origin story for the Hal Jordan version of Green Lantern. I do prefer Hal Jordan over John Stewart because Hal Jordan's a bit more quippy, he's a bit more fun, he's a bit more light-hearted, he's not as militaristic, discipline this and discipline that. He's a bit more of a daredevil character. So yeah, this is an enjoyable first flight. It's a good look into the world of Green Lantern. Taking us to Oa and showing us the training and whatnot. So yeah, very much like the live action movie in many respects, but better. Superman Doomsday is the film that really started it all for this line of films. It is the first one that they made, and I liked it. When it first came out, I really liked it. Condensing down the whole Superman and Reign of the Supermen story into a 70-minute movie, 80-minute movie is very hard to do. And I think, yes, they've had to lose a lot of things. They've had to change a lot of things. But I think as a movie, it works pretty well. It's got some really solid action in it. The voice cast is great. I like the animation. I really like it. Has it been bettered since with the likes of Death of Superman and Reign of Superman? Yeah, it has, because they're more faithful to the original story, but they got more time to play with that story as well. But as a first effort, I thought this was really good, and again, a really underrated film in this canon. Batman Bad Blood brings the Bat family together, really. It explores Batman's wider circle. You've got Batwoman in there, you've got Batwing, you've got the various Robins, Nightwing and whatnot. So, you know, if you're a fan of Batman, if you're a fan of like stories that involve his wider family kind of dynamic, then this is a pretty good movie. It's fairly generic in many ways, as a lot of these movies are, but it is a lot of fun, and it's one of them that was better for me on second watch than it was first time around. Batman Hush has the disadvantage of adapting what is, quite frankly, one of the best comic book stories of the last 20-30 years, in terms of Batman at any rate. It changes up a few things. It switches a few things around, like leaves some things out, changes some things, not necessarily for the better, but I can kind of understand why they did it. You know, again, you're working with a fairly short running time, you've got to condense things down, and changing certain things allows for you to bring that running time down, to cut corners, so to speak. Does that make the movie perfect? No, not really. But again, it's that idea of accepting that a book is a book and a movie is a movie. And I can see why they've changed certain things. I liked it. It's again, it's not perfect, but it is a pretty good adaptation of what is an absolute classic story. Justice League versus the Teen Titans it's one of them films where it's like, really? Teen Titans going up against the Justice League? All right, but actually once the movie plays out, it's actually a pretty good movie. It's a really good movie, in fact. I enjoyed this a lot more than I thought I was going to, and they find ways to kind of have these battles and whatnot without it being totally ridiculous. Teen Titans is not something I've ever been particularly drawn to. So when this movie came out, I was like, all right, okay. It's a DC animated movie, I'll check it out. At least it's got the Justice League in. But actually it was a lot better than I was expecting. And I did want to stick with the Teen Titan characters a lot more than I was expecting to. Suicide Squad Hell to Pay is a really good Suicide Squad movie. I will say that it runs a little bit too long. This is one of the longer ones in this bunch. And I do feel that running time at times. But for the most part, I think they do a really good job of getting this bunch of disparate characters together and bringing out their, you know, conflicting personalities, so to speak, and sending them on a journey. Yeah, it's a really solid Suicide Squad movie. You watch this before you watch the live action stuff, and you realise, yeah, that's how a live action Suicide Squad movie could work. Batman and Harley Quinn does not seem to be a fan favourite. I think a lot of that is down to a lot of the sexual stuff they work in between Harley Quinn and Nightwing. But, you know, it's a very brief part of the plot, and it's there for laughs. And you know what? I laughed. It's done, again, in the style of Batman the Animated Series, and I love Batman the Animated Series. I love that animation style, and I like the villains in this. Poison Ivy and Dr. whatever his face is that I can't remember the name of right now. But yeah, I like this team dynamic. Sticking Harley Quinn in the middle of Batman and Robin, kind of forcing her to help them in their journey, and they never truly know if she's going to be a help or a hindrance. It's a fun dynamic. This is a movie that is just meant to be fun. It's not meant to be taken too seriously. I think it's just Bruce Timm having a blast. And actually, you know, when I watch it, every time I've watched it, I've been hugely entertained by it. I find it quite hilarious at times, in fact. So yeah, very entertaining and somewhat underrated movie. Batman Gotham Knight kind of takes place within the world of the Christopher Nolan Batman movies, the Dark Knight trilogy. I think you can take it with those films and include it as canon if you want, but I think it also does quite a bit to distance itself from them as well and stand on its own terms. It is one of them movies that is a collection of short films kind of put together, but I think it does it much better than what, say, Emerald Knights did for Green Lantern, primarily due to the fact that the animation is top tier. You know, this is animation that is done by a lot of your Japanese proper manga style animators, and it really works for the character of Batman. I think there's something about Batman that is very kind of ninja or samurai-esque with his code, his code of honor and whatnot, and I think that lends itself particularly well to your manga style. And like I say, the animation here is top tier. Justice League Doom is a really good film because it centers mostly on Batman. It's an adaptation of a famous Batman Justice League story in which Batman's plans kind of are brought, well, they're used against the Justice League. So Batman has created plans to bring down the Justice League if ever he needs. If ever they go rogue, he needs to know that he can take them down. But somebody takes those plans and uses them against the Justice League. That's a great idea. It's a really great idea for a comic book, for a film. It just shows what a badass Batman is. It shows how he's always one step ahead of the game. He's always got plans above plans on plans for. Yeah, he's always the smartest guy in the room, and I just think, yeah, if you're a Batman fan, this is a really great Batman movie. Reign of the Supermen is the sequel to Death of Superman. It is an adaptation, obviously, of the comic book source material. It does change it quite a lot. You know, I've talked already about various movies in here that have been adaptations, and they've changed things, not necessarily for the better. I think here as well, it's not necessarily for the better, but it's still a pretty good story. Thematically, it's quite rich. It works really well to condense what was quite a large story. To condense it down into an hour and a half movie, you are going to have to lose stuff. You are going to have to change things. But I think they do it in a way that is narratively satisfying while still holding on to what made Reign of the Superman the story it was. Justice League Crisis on Two Earths takes a story that has kind of been done numerous times before, you know, where you have a version of the Justice League from a parallel universe that come through to ours, and it turns out they're more evil. They're like an evil version of the Justice League. It was done in the Justice League animated series, but here I really like what they do with it. It has a feel of Watchmen about it. You know, you got the evil version of Batman that feels almost like a mishmash of Night Owl and a few other characters from Watchmen. But yeah, just seeing Batman, our Batman, and evil Batman at the end kind of going up against each other and trying to outsmart each other. I like the pairing up of these two different groups. I like the execution of the story. I think they've done it really well here. Like I say, it's been done in various forms at various different times, and this is one of my favourite iterations of this kind of story. Batman: The Dark Knight Returns Part 2. I know a lot of people put this above Part 1. I think that's helped by the fact it's got Joker in it. It's got the famous fight scene in it between Batman and Superman, in which Batman owns Superman, which is great. And this is a great movie as well. It's a great adaptation. It's a really faithful adaptation of the source material. It's just, for me, there's a bit too much going on. It feels like not as contained as the first part because you've got all these different characters. Is the story Batman against Superman, or is it against the Joker? And then you've got all this other stuff with the Robin in it and Catwoman. So it's all great. Don't get me wrong. But for me, I feel like the first part feels a lot more linear. It feels a lot more focused, I would say, even though the villains in it are not, they're not like your archetypal, iconic Batman villains. It's these mutant guys and this mutant leader, but I love how they handle Batman in the first part, and what they do with that story. But the whole thing really is just one long film split into two. But yeah, part 2 sits a bit further down than part 1 for me. Batman vs Robin is a loose adaptation really, of the Court of Owls storyline, but it throws in Damian Wayne's Robin and finds a way to get Batman and Robin at loggerheads with each other. So it's a mishmash of a few different stories, but it's quite dark. For one of these movies, it's one of the darker ones. The action in it is quite brutal. The characterizations are really well drawn, and I think the way in which they've adapted the stories is very solid. It's one of the better ways they've adapted an iconic story from the comic book. Justice League New Frontier, once again, a really great adaptation of the source material. This kind of has a similar flavour to it as All-Star Superman, but I think it does a much better job in the story department. I think the story that has been crafted here is far more engaging. The characters are much better drawn with regards to how they're written, and I do slightly prefer the animation here actually over All-Star Superman. So yeah, it's much better, I would say. In that kind of harkening back to a more nostalgic time, and yeah, situating your Justice League in a bygone era. I think it works much better here than it did with All-Star Superman. Justice League Gods and Monsters, once again, I just said about that whole idea of taking the Justice League from a different reality and making them evil or making them different in some way. This is kind of like one of them. It's very good. This is one of those films that's really gone up in my esteem over the years. I didn't appreciate it quite as much first time around because it wasn't our Justice League. It was an alternate Justice League, and I'm just like, all right, whatever. But actually, the more that I've accepted it on its own terms and just come to the story for what it is, the more I've kind of found from it that is deep and rich and thematic and works. It's very well written. Actually, it's one of the best written films in this series, and I think it can be overlooked because it isn't our Justice League. It is this alternate reality version, but no, it's very solid stuff. Justice League Dark Apocalypse War is the film that kind of ended the first DC universe animated series. The one that kind of where the films followed on and all existed within the same kind of universe. This was the one that ended it all before we got Superman Man of Tomorrow, and it goes out on a pretty good high. It's very action-packed. There's a lot of kind of surprising deaths and this, that, and they really go all out to end this particular timeline, and because of that, nobody is particularly safe. But yeah, it feels like the stakes are real, the stakes are high, and it ends in a way that is kind of like, yes, it's a victory, but it's also a loss, depending on how you want to look at it. It's a really great ending to that run. Justice League, the Flashpoint Paradox, was kind of the beginning of that run, to be honest. This is where the continuity kind of really came into play, and they thought, actually, we're going to connect all these. And it's also the adaptation of a famous comic book story, Flashpoint Paradox. Flashpoint, so it's so well done. Like, for one of these movies, it's one of them where they've really adapted the source material and done a bang up job with it. And you got the new Flash movie coming out, and it's going to take a lot of inspiration really from this story, I imagine. But yeah, it's really got its work cut out for it to match what they did here with this animated movie, because this is one of the best ones. There's not much between part 1 and part 2 of Batman the Long Halloween. I've put part 2 just under, so yeah, part 1's slightly above, so they're both in this spot here. But yeah, as one long complete movie, it's really good. Again, they changed some things, but I feel like they make certain things clearer that wasn't as clear in the comic book. I mean, changed as well, but I feel like in the comic book there was I was left with certain questions about the identities of certain people that kind of made me go, okay, so what happened? Whereas here, I don't feel that way. Here, I feel like they address it, they make it much clearer, and as a result, I'm much more satisfied by the story. I think the voice cast is great, the animation's great, they take the time with the story, obviously, because they go across 2 movies, and yeah, one of the best ones. Batman and Superman Battle of the Super Sons was a real surprise for me. I highly enjoyed this film. I thought the chemistry between the characters of Jonathan Kent and Damian Wayne was really well handled. The animation was vastly improved as well, I thought, from previous entries in the DC animated movies. So yeah, one of the best of recent efforts. The Death of Superman adapts the Death of Superman story from the comic books, which obviously is one of the most iconic stories in comic books, particularly in Superman comic books, but just any superhero comic books for that matter. It's iconic, and they do a really good job of adapting it. And one of the things that I think they really get right is that they take their time. They're not in any hurry to get to the big smackdown between Superman and Doomsday, which I know to some people may sound boring, but actually they take their time in developing the relationship between Superman and Lois so that when stuff starts happening, you suddenly find yourself caring. You suddenly find yourself in the mindset of Lois or Jimmy Olsen and people like that. And you suddenly realise what the stakes are in their mindset. Batman Under the Red Hood, again, absolutely fantastic. They go balls to the wall with the dark edges of it. You know, they don't hold back in showing us the Red Hood doing what the Red Hood does in the comic books, which is being a real badass and not taking any prisoners. Just adapting that story as well of Jason Todd coming back into the fold after so many years of being believed to be dead, and yeah, it's really great. I think Jensen Ackles does a fantastic job in the voice department as well. All the voice cast is on point, the action is on point, the animation's really good. It's yeah, top tier DC animated movie material. Batman The Dark Knight Returns Part 1, as I've already stated, I do put this higher up than Part 2 just because it feels like a more, as I say, focused story. It's not all over the place with different characters, and it focuses in purely on Batman, who he is right now in this period of time, which is, you know, in the future. It tells us who he is, what he's become, why he's become it, and shows us like that he's essentially had a fall from grace, and this film is about him working his way back to who he was, perhaps. We get this villain in it, this mutant leader, who, yeah, okay, he's not a classic villain. He was kind of made for the Frank Miller story, but I do love their showdown. I think the way Batman brutalizes him in order to make his point kind of reminds me in many ways of the story Batman Cult. But yeah, I think it has much more impact as an ending, as a solid kind of complete story. If you don't have the scene at the end of this with Joker kind of tacked on to tell us that there's more coming, then this does perfectly stand on its own. Batman Gotham by Gaslight is a fantastic rendering of a story that was pretty good in comic book form, but I actually feel is better here as an animated movie. Not to give too much away in case you haven't seen it, but they changed the ending and they make the identity of Jack the Ripper known. They tell us who he is, and who he is actually quite a surprise if you're a fan of the Batman mythology, the Batman characters, but in a way that I think is earned, and that it makes you go, oh, that's a bold choice. And yeah, I like the style of this movie. I like the way they use characters from the Batman mythology in a way that is meaningful, as opposed to like Batman Doom that came to Gotham. That movie just felt like that. Oh, let's name check this. That just for me was the wrong approach. Whereas here, they take characters that we know and love, and they find ways to use them that is important to the story, rather than just peppering them in there because, hey, people will get this reference. Oh, they'll know who this is. No, it feels like the choices they make are made for good reason. Batman Year One for me is probably the greatest comic book story of all time. My favorite. It's my favorite Batman story of all time, I think. I just think it's an absolute masterpiece. So adapting it into a film was always going to be a bit tricky, but they go essentially the Zack Snyder route here of just adapting it really faithfully, panel by panel. I think to some degree that does lessen the effect of the movie because you know exactly what's coming, but the story's just it's just a great story. I think if there's one thing that I could change about it, it'd be that I wish they could have done a bit more to show that passage of time. In the comic books, you get it because there's all these little panels that tell you like diary entries and things that say, oh, we're now here and we're now here. Whereas here it's just like, really? Was that a whole year? Did that whole film take place over a year? But beyond that, as far as an adaptation goes, it's absolutely fantastic. And it is, as I say, the comic book is my favourite rendition of the Batman character. So seeing that on screen, faithfully portrayed, I loved it. But it may surprise many out there to learn that my favourite DC animated movie in this line, that is, if you're not counting Batman Mask of the Phantasm, is actually not a Batman movie. It's a Wonder Woman movie. It is Wonder Woman, just the self-titled Wonder Woman movie, again, directed by Lauren Montgomery. I think she does an amazing job with the action sequences, and I think she does an amazing job with the characterizations. All the characters she's got to work with. This was essentially my introduction to Wonder Woman. I'd never read a Wonder Woman comic book before this. I'd never really watched the TV show. It was always a character that I thought, oh, really? Are they going to do... How's that going to work? But I watched this and I've loved it. I've always loved it. It's since the moment I saw it, it's been literally my favourite in this line of movies, and it's always been the one to beat. And so far, it hasn't been beaten. I just think they do an amazing job. It came before the Patty Jenkins film, and I just thought, yeah, if you can take that and put it on the big screen as live action, that's a Wonder Woman movie that I want to see. Patty Jenkins did indeed do that. I think there's a lot of correlations between this film and the Patty Jenkins movie. Yeah, so it's a good story. It's a great character, and I think Lauren Montgomery has you can sense that she has a real respect for this character, a real love for this character, and it just shines through in every scene of this movie, which is a joy from start to finish. I think it's plotted really well, it's cast really well, the animation is great, and the action sequences are fantastic. So yeah, as I say, this is my number one, Wonder Woman, still the one to beat. But let's see where they go in the next 50 of these movies. So yeah. If you've seen all these movies, then how would you rank them? Are you a fan of these DC animated movies? Which are your favourite ones? If you don't want to rank them all, tell me which your favourite ones are. Give me your top 5 and your bottom 5 or whatever. Or just tell me which one is your favourite. Yeah, leave your comments down below. Let me know what you thought of my choices. Thank you for watching this video, and until next time, cracking.